All right, welcome. We are going to go ahead and get started as close to us time as possible today. We have a packed session for you focused on the state of social science in bird conservation. We know this has been a popular topic amongst the bird conservation community and are thrilled to have you all joining us today. My name is Katie Holland. I am the lead social scientist with Road to Recovery and an assistant research professor now at Georgetown University, formerly working at Virginia Tech. And really enjoying my time in the bird conservation community and with this social science community that has made up our speakers and panelists for today. So welcome to the session. A few housekeeping stage setting items to get us going. As I just mentioned, but I'll mention once more now as our numbers continue to grow as people join the meeting. We do have simultaneous translation in place for the meeting today, so you can participate fully in either English or Spanish. You'll see instructions for that in the chat, but if you look at the bottom of your Zoom controls, there's a globe icon. You can click on that icon and select the language that you would like to participate in today. If you don't immediately see the globe, there's three dots that usually say more, or there's just three dots. Click on those, and you'll be able to select your language preference there. Thank you so much to our incredible translator, Bailin, who has been with Road to Recovery for a while now. We're so grateful for helping us make these sessions as accessible as possible. We do have a few community expectations with a group this size for our session today. We have 9 panelists and several speakers. We ask that you remain muted during the session. You can use the Q&A, which I'll overview in a minute, feature to ask questions. We will not be able to get to all of them during the session today, but we are preparing follow-up materials and continued engagement on these topics. We do have a shared tool that I'll again show you in just a minute as well for further engagement with the panelists, with myself and our other speakers, and to inform our follow-up following this meeting. So though we meet virtually today, I do like to begin these sessions with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining the session from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is traditional territory of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, who've shared this land here for generations. And as we gather to discuss the conservation of birds and their habitats, we honor the deep ecological knowledge and enduring relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the land, water, and with all beings, including our shared birds. We can learn so much from these traditions, and we continue to strive to do that. So in the spirit of those traditions and our topics of interest for this session today, focus on bringing birds and people together in our work. We focus with the goal of contributing to a future where both people and wildlife can thrive in harmony. And that's ultimately why we do the work that we do and why so many people have shown interest in this topic of integrating social science and human dimensions into bird conservation. Yep. So a quick overview of our agenda today. You're hearing a welcome and some logistics from yours truly. I'll turn it over to Dr. Ashley Dayer for some introductory remarks. And then we have 3 panels today. Our panels will focus on 3 topics that we as the social scientists in this community, or some of them at least, have identified as being really useful to overview. So panel 1 will focus on the idea of what conservation social science is and what it is not. Panel 2 will focus on how we can apply conservation social science directly to bird conservation. And panel 3 will look forward to future directions and priorities in bird conservation as we utilize and integrate social science. So as I mentioned, we have 2 ways that you can share your thoughts with us during today's session. These will show up in the chat box for you as well with a link to our Google Doc. So because we have a large size, we ask that you put questions for speakers or panelists into the Q&A box. You'll see a link at the bottom of your Zoom screen for Q&A. That's where you can enter questions for the panelists. Our panelists will all be monitoring that Q&A box and contributing to answers to those questions. We also have a Google Slides document that you can use as well. Please put questions in the Q&A box so we see them immediately. But we're also interested in learning about challenges that your organization is facing related to social science integration, as well as hearing where you've been successful. So there's slides in this Google Doc with sticky notes like you see here, where you can enter comments, thoughts, ideas on those challenges and successes. Our team will keep the slides open, so there's always space for you to contribute those thoughts. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to a friend and colleague, Dr. Ashley Dare, who will give introductory remarks for our session. Dr. Dare is a professor of human dimensions in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation at Virginia Tech. She leads the Dare Human Dimensions Lab, where her team studies people's relationship with wildlife, particularly birds, and related conservation behaviors. Ashley's work bridges research and practice through collaborations with agencies, NGOs, and conservation partnerships across the Americas. Ashley is well known for advancing consideration of people in bird conservation efforts and for co-founding the NABCI Human Dimensions Subcommittee. Ashley supervised the National Bird Conservation Social Scientists that facilitated integration of social science and bird conservation for nearly a decade. And I was the third person in that role, and really thrilled to have been able to contribute in that capacity and continue to be a part of this community. Ashley has served as a social science advisor for the National Audubon Society, president of the Society for Conservation Biology's Social Science Working Group, among other numerous roles in bird conservation. So Ashley, thanks so much for being here today and for being willing to give these introductory remarks. We're grateful for all of your contributions. I'll stop sharing so that you can.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. I'm going to bring up my slides here. Does that look good to you?
Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Great to have such a big crowd here today, interested in the state of bird conservation social science. And I'm honored to be able to share the introductory remarks and then also join all of these panelists who are working in our field. Some of you like to know that I like to tell stories in my presentations. So today we're going to start a story with our traditional Once Upon a Time, although it's not fully a fairy tale, but a little bit more realistic. So many of you have already heard me tell my story about how I became involved in bird conservation, and particularly bird conservation social science. But briefly, I started as a biologist in Hawaii in 2001, working with Hawaiian honey creepers, having a great time running around the rainforest, traveling to and from the rainforest in helicopters. We were working on a really urgent project, which was trying to save the world's rarest bird at the time, the po'ouli, a Hawaiian honey creeper. When we were working on the project, it was believed that there were 3 individuals left. Fast forward a bit, and sadly, we watched the species go extinct, with this photo of a museum specimen of the last bird haunting me to this day. Although this is an abbreviation of the story, I will say that that experience and realizing that so little of the public was aware of what was going on in Hawaii and that that was causing a huge challenge for conservation led me to become a social scientist focused on figuring out the best ways to involve people in conservation so that I would never again watch a species go extinct. Now, since you've already heard that story, most likely for anyone who's seen me present before, I thought I'd move on to a chapter 2 that relates more to our topic today, about what's been going on in my life as a bird conservation social scientist, following along the story of what's been happening in the field of bird conservation social science. So this started about 18 years ago after getting my master's degree in human dimensions. I was lucky to be involved with some of the initial push to consider social science in bird conservation. Looking back to 2007 at the Partners Flight and Flight Conference in McAllen, Texas, probably many of you remember this conference very fondly. We had a great setup at that conference. Every single session had to include a human-related component. whether that be communications or social science or education. And a couple of us there had some social science experience. So, like this session's lead title or lead presentation slide that I have here, um, I was able to focus on thinking about what is the value of population objectives for various audiences, and do people actually care about the numbers that we spend so much time developing in bird conservation? And one of my takeaways from that presentation, and a takeaway I often gave at that time, was to think about how the work that we were doing in bird conservation could be enhanced by working with professionals who were educators and conservation communicators, and thinking about how social science could build that bridge to help ensure that educators could have the best information available on how to work with the public and interpret the information in bird conservation. We then moved forward a little bit to the bird conservation conferences in the Northeast. There were two of those that brought together all of the community in the Northeast, and those had a lot of focus on the human element of bird conservation and also talked about the social sciences. At the time, we were just starting in bird conservation to be really thinking about private lands programs and the Farm Bill. Particularly in the Northeast. People hadn't been talking about it that much until this time, about 15 years ago. And so I gave a talk that related to my dissertation work, which was about how do we bring conservation social science into private lands conservation. At the time, the way we were talking about conservation social science was I thought of it as a performance enhancing drug. How could we improve conservation efforts by thinking about social science as a way to improve that work? I will say that is the only time I have used that analogy again until today. Um, Moving forward a little bit to the next bird conservation conference, we started thinking about the role of social science tied to the implementation gap. I teamed up with my mentor from Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Ken Rosenberg, before he gained the fame as the lead author of the 3 Billion Birds paper. And we gave a plenary at that conference about this issue of bridging the implementation gap. And he was the ghost of bird conservation past, and I was the ghost of bird conservation future. Thank you, Ken, for playing that game with me. And we talked about how we have this issue that we still have in bird conservation, where we do a lot of great scientific work that often does lead to conservation plans that are well defined, but doesn't always lead to implementation. And Ken and I were encouraging folks to think about how bringing social science and biological science together could help better allow us to develop conservation plans that would be effective, and how engaging scientists in the actual act of working towards implementation could also improve the way we do conservation. At the time, we were talking about and I guess this is probably one of the first talks where I began to use this quote that many others have quoted me as saying since, that the conservation solution is not about changing birds' behavior, except for maybe in the example of where you're trying to get them off the runway, but instead it's about changing people's behavior. I now will say to some degree, I regret that quote, but you'll be hearing more on that later from the panel. But certainly resonated with a lot of folks thinking about, okay, how do we involve people better in conservation? Fast forward to 2013, and this was when the first NABCI workshop, North American Bird Conservation Initiative workshop, was held about human dimensions. About 50 leaders in bird conservation, including state agency directors, leaders of Fish and Wildlife Service, and much of the NABCI US committee came together to talk about how social science could be useful to bird conservation. And part of that was just getting everyone on the same page about what do we mean by conservation social science? What do we mean by human dimensions? From that, Roxanne Bogart put together a great all-bird bulletin where every one of the bird conservation initiatives talked about how they were thinking about social science. And we saw some strong examples of studies that were being undertaken, like from the Waterfowl Management Plan folks who were doing a survey of birders and thinking about the three-legged stool. Interestingly, this is the last assessment of social science in bird conservation until this webinar today, and that was about 12 years ago. The cool thing from this effort is it led to the first NABCI Human Dimensions Subcommittee that now is in its 11th year. Katie has been chairing that for the last couple of years, and you'll hear more about the next steps for that committee at the end of our session today. It also led to the National Bird Conservation Social Science Coordinators, as Katie mentioned, held by three different people over that 10-year period: Ashley Gramza, who you'll hear from today, Jessica Barnes, and then also Katie as well. And this excellent group of scientists has really done a great job of helping folks in the bird conservation community understand what are the bird conservation social sciences and how can they be useful, and then also trying to help them with integration. So Ashley Gramza worked on developing a fact sheet and presentations to help the bird conservation community understand the field, and that's still available on NABCI's website if it's of interest to you. She also worked with the subcommittee to develop a whole series of success stories that showed how social science could be usefully brought to bear. And then finally, she and Jessica Barnes worked together with me to develop a guide for how joint ventures could bring in human dimensions. Jessica moved on to working with others in the committee to develop whole sessions at ornithological conferences to talk about how social science could be useful to bird conservation. This led to publications on the need to include social science in societies. And then ultimately, it led to the ornithological applications having a call for social science papers in their journal and adding on assistant editors or associate editors to the journal who focus on social science. So really the ornithological field embracing social science. As the Road to Recovery effort has grown as well, it has realized the value of the human dimensions to our, I think it was our third workshop that was held remotely, had a really big focus on the role of people in bird conservation, and a guidance document that came out afterwards on how to incorporate the ideas of co-production, social science, and communications effectively into species working groups. And then finally, the R2R species recovery wheel, also including social science in the various aspects of it, largely due to the work of Katie Holland and others. So as you can see, it's been a long chapter 2, almost 20 years of trying to incorporate social science into bird conservation. And although I told this from my perspective, it's been the involvement of lots of different folks who you're going to hear from today, as well as others who are in the audience and elsewhere. I'm no longer a PhD student, and now a professor myself, and white hair coming in and reading glasses. So it's taken a little bit of time to get there, but I believe we have arrived. And that's really exciting to be able to say. We're no longer starting our talks with a conversation about what is human dimensions, but for anyone who's new, this is the definition of human dimensions. Likewise, we're not as commonly describing conservation social science, although we are often talking about how it's an umbrella for all of the social sciences and not synonymous just with sociology, as we're using that term more commonly. I am really excited to see that so many organizations have realized the value of social science, or maybe drank the Kool-Aid, as we might say. The supply chain is probably not still keeping up with the interest, but we do see bird conservation biologists getting social science PhDs themselves. We see bird conservation NGOs hiring social scientists. We see joint ventures hiring social scientists, etc. And we're overcoming barriers to social science integration that have been highlighted in the broader conservation social science field. We see folks gaining skills in social science knowledge by coming to webinars like this and attending other trainings. We see social scientists getting involved in projects from the beginning, which is so essential for effective collaboration. We see social science going into conservation planning, and we see social science capacity growing in organizations. All of these things could be done more, but we see them happening. We do continue to have ongoing challenges with just one person in a lot of organizations doing social science. There's a lot of challenges for them with being able to achieve all that the organization or agency might be asking for, and sometimes leading to burnout for those organizations or those individuals. We see more bird conservation efforts wanting to connect than there are social scientists often available to connect with them, or at least them not being aware of how to find those social scientists. And we see that there still is an implementation gap, I believe, in social science itself, with lots of great social science happening across the broader conservation social science community, but not necessarily coming together. Finally, as I wrap up my remarks, I did want to make a caveat. This is a perspective that's very North American dominated, as that's where I do most of my work. I have collaborated occasionally with colleagues in Latin America, as on this manuscript that we were able to write together about 5 years ago, and happy to have some of our Latin American colleagues on the call today. And I do think that that's a place where we can continue to improve. So as we wrap up, just a reminder of an important vision. We still need to accomplish the 5 game-changing paradigms in conservation, and a version of that that keeps bird conservation social science at the forefront, because bird conservation is fundamentally a human endeavor. We need to think about having a coalition through co-production, about having social science integrated as limiting factors are defined, of creating roadmaps for recovery with social scientists involved, thinking about having a legislative agenda that considers social science, and then thinking about having unified messaging through strategic communications. So with that, then I think we will certainly be at a very happy end. And I hope, though, that we are not there anytime soon, and I don't think we will be. But I do think we are getting closer to having really successful integration of social science. And I hope that you all enjoy thinking more about that today with us for the next hour and a half.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Really helpful orientation to this field and this community. We've come a long way. Um, Sorry, my screen. Did you see my screen? Um, we've come a long way in this field thanks to the work of Ashley and so many others that you'll hear from today. Trying to share. Are you all able to see my screen?
It's coming up.
It's coming up. Okay. Screen sharing. I don't know why it's paused. Okay. Well, that's okay. We don't need it right now. It's a slide that has our panelists' names, but I'm going to introduce them and we'll get them pinned up at the top of this screen. So that will work fine. So as I said earlier, our first panel is going to focus on what conservation social science is and what it is not. As Ashley mentioned, those of us who have come together to organize this session, which I neglected to mention, is a collaboration between the NABCI Human Dimensions Subcommittee and Road to Recovery to put this session on today. Our speakers have come together. We've really enjoyed coming together in this community of social scientists directly involved in bird conservation. The field's growing. We found this as a key opportunity and a moment in time in bird conservation for us to think about defining the field, dispelling misconceptions that we all come across commonly in our work, and setting the foundation for not just what conservation social science is, but what role it plays, what impact it can have in bird conservation. And so welcome our first panelists. I'm going to introduce each of them. And like I said, we'll get them pinned up at the top. We've framed this as a conversation, so you'll hear from all of them as we discuss this topic. Our first panelist is Dr. Justin Beal. Justin is a conservation social scientist whose research primarily focuses on understanding the factors that influence both individual and collective voluntary conservation on private lands. Justin is currently at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. Prior to that, he was a postdoctoral associate at Virginia Tech in the Dare Lab of Human Dimensions. A core aim of Justin's work is understanding how programs for landowners can support both conservation and human livelihoods, especially in the face of global change. And I know Justin has some background with some global change and climate change efforts as well. So Justin, thanks for joining us. Our second panelist for this first panel is Carrie Grimm. Carrie is the Director of Conservation Social Science at the National Audubon Society. She collaborates with teams across Audubon and other institutions working on projects that advance Audubon's habitat conservation, climate policy, and community building goals, no small tasks, across the hemisphere. Over the past 20 years, Carrie's research has aimed at both protecting biodiversity and supporting people's livelihoods. So welcome, Carrie. And our third panelist today is Liat Wild. Liat is a conservation social scientist at Point Blue Conservation Science. Having joined the organization as the first social scientist just over a year ago, Liat plays a cross-organizational role supporting the integration of social science into the organization's existing research and conservation activities. And you'll hear more from each of these three as they introduce themselves in the panel as well. Thank you both. Thank you all for joining us. It's really wonderful to have all three of your organizations represented on this panel and in this conversation. So let's start orienting the audience to who you are and your work. So could you each share, I mentioned your current roles, but a little more on what you do currently in your organization and how you came to work at the intersection of social science and bird conservation. I think it's safe to say very few of us set out with the goal of being a social scientist in bird conservation. We've all took kind of twisty paths to land on this panel. So if you kind of share your path to this work, that would be great. Carrie, let's start with you.
Thank you, Katie. So I started with a degree in environmental science, focusing on social science at Oregon State University. Worked at NAU as a lecturer, and then most recently was consulting and working a lot with conservation organizations such as the Nature Conservancy and other institutions like Smithsonian, and really like the applied aspect of conservation. And so I wasn't necessarily looking to get involved in a bird organization specifically, but a conservation organization. And one thing I really love about Audubon is that although birds are obviously a focus of Audubon, the mission is to protect birds in the places they need, and while providing benefits for birds and habitat and wildlife and people. And that holistic approach really drew me because I love that it included people, that birds could be a focus, but really looking at habitat more widely. And a lot of the work that I'm doing ranges across ecosystems from wetlands to rangelands to tropical forests. And working with really diverse communities such as ranchers to indigenous communities in Latin America. So it's been really great to see how social science is really helping with Audubon's holistic approach to conservation.
Thanks, Carrie, and we're certainly glad that your path landed you at Audubon and by extension with us. I think that for many of us, birds are the bonus and people are the focus, and it's really exciting to see how these organizations like Audubon are centering people as well in their work. Liat, you want to share your path to this panel?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Liat Wild. I'm a conservation social scientist at Point Blue, located in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. I just wanted to give like a little bit more background about Point Blue because I think it speaks to the path. So Point Blue started as a bird observatory and grew to include restoration, environmental education, various different biological monitoring and ecological research projects, and policy application. And I think that that was all set up and led to the creation of my position. And so I really think that that socio-ecological philosophical approach to conservation is like a huge part of my path. Like I said, I joined the organization just over a year ago, and previously I was working with a conservation organization in Ecuador called the Foundation for the Conservation of the Tropical Andes, FCAT. And there I was a social science research coordinator. It's a biological field station, and I was the first social scientist to go down there and do graduate work. And that led to doing international education work and bringing more social scientists to do research there. And so I think a big part of my path is being a part of these, or like seeing the institutional changes. And like at Point Blue, the fact that socio-ecological approach seemed to be kind of like set up in the works as I was joining has made my job a lot easier. So I'm grateful for that, and I'm excited to keep helping it grow.
Well, we're thrilled that you're there. And I agree. I think coming into organizations that have that mindset of bringing social and ecological components of conservation challenges together is a great place to land as a social scientist, and really facilitates the integration work that we're all trying to do. And Justin, that's a great transition to Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, because I know that is a place where that is certainly the case as well. Do you want to give a little context on your journey to Bird Conservancy?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's certainly a lot of parallels between Liat's position and mine. I'm also the first conservation social scientist at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, have been here since February, working in this position. And this role really focuses on, in a lot of ways, informing the existing efforts of BCR. So working directly with our stewardship team, and those are the folks who are on the ground working with private landowners to implement these conservation practices on private lands to benefit birds. And so my role is working with them to really understand and co-produce research that examines how we can both enhance our individual landowner engagement efforts, but also how do we facilitate collective action that spans property boundaries that can have a larger impact for birds. And so in terms of how I got here, Katie, you alluded to this, it was a very winding journey. But I feel very at home now. I started off very broadly in an environmental science degree, having no idea what I wanted to do, just wanting to help the environment in one way or another. Started taking some human dimensions electives, and that was where I really locked in on what I wanted to focus on, which is like, it's so interesting. Every single environmental problem that I'm seeing has this human element to it. So I went and did a degree in ecotourism at University of Georgia, then at NC State. I kind of became what some have referred to as a shiny object researcher, where I was sort of interested in a whole range of things, and would kind of just latch onto these different projects and worked on a lot of different topic areas. But joining the DARE lab, I sort of honed in on private lands and climate adaptation as an area that I really wanted to focus on. And that being a bird-focused lab, I think all the pieces just sort of fit together nicely. And with the BCR job coming out, I said to myself, this just seems like the perfect opportunity. So it really allows me to meet all of those personal goals and interests of finding ways to promote adaptation in a way that facilitates both positive outcomes for conservation and supports human livelihoods. So yeah, I think that's about it.
Awesome. Well, it's really great to see all three of you and see all three of these organizations represented in this conversation, because I know all three are doing really great work across the realm that bird conservation has to touch. So the theme of this panel is, what is conservation social science and what is it not? So let's start with what it is, and can we shorten those up and sum it up? So you all three work directly with field biologists often. If you summed up what this field is in a sentence, what would it be? So we'll go backwards. Justin, we'll start with you, and then we'll go work around to Carrie.
All right, in one sentence, I like to think of conservation social scientists as a toolbox that consists of various different tools or insights from social sciences that can help us navigate these social dimensions of conservation issues that we face.
I love that analogy. Yeah, I love that, because there's so many pieces. Helps us to kind of visualize that needs piece too, which I'll use that as a plug to encourage everyone to contribute those needs and successes in that Google Doc as well. Leah, what about you?
Yeah, I love the toolbox analogy, and I'll add that within that toolbox, there are many different disciplines and disciplinary trainings, including sociology, economics, anthropology. So when we're called social science, we don't say you're a natural scientist to, natural scientists who have very specific training. So I think that that is something that I get called often. But that conservation social science, the goal is to understand and improve conservation policy, practice, and outcomes by really focusing in on the human dimensions.
Also, that's an excellent point that I know all of us encounter a lot, is that we are all conservation social scientists, but under that umbrella, we have specific areas of expertise, and no one of us does all of those things. It's important to kind of parse out what those are. Carrie, what about you? Do you have a defining sentence for biologists that you work with?
Well, Justin and Leah caught some of that. And so I'm going to provide an additional aspect is that I like to also make clear the science that social sciences do, our scientists do, is similar to that of natural science in the sense of we're using a systematic way to understand the world. And for us, our world is, people or people interacting with the environment or with each other based on evidence. And so I try to also make it clear that we are doing science, and social science, like other types of science, are using some very similar, different methods, but the same sort of being systematic and trying to find evidence to understand larger picture topics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And as general advice for the audience, nothing angers a social scientist more than referring to hard science or just science and then put us over here. Like what we do is science, and it is very systematic and informed. These are our called areas of expertise for a reason. So we want to make sure we highlight those. So along those lines, and Carrie, I'll stay with you if that's okay. When we think about defining conservation social science in our work, we want to define it. We also want to distinguish it. So can you speak a little bit to how you define it in your work, and also how you distinguish conservation social science work that you do from other things that are important, like public opinion research or engagement work?
Yeah. So, going again to that is like, I think that conservation social science and my work is really using methods, existing literature that's out there to understand how people impact and are impacted by the environment and conservation initiatives, and also how they interact with each other around that. And so in my own work, this has been really broad, from identifying ways to inclusively engage diverse community members in conservation initiatives to one of the things I'm doing now is leading a team to identify social metrics to help with evaluating and monitoring the Audubon Conservation Ranching Program. So it's really wide, it's really diverse, but the key really through it all is, again, having really sound methods that are, reliable, replicable, and that we can then generalize our studies beyond just here's one case study, similar again to other sciences that are out there. And one thing, how I think it's different, I'm going to focus on the engagement partially because I work a lot around community engagement, is engaging people, having community engagement, workshops, doing outreach. It's all important. It's all really great. And there's a social component, right? People are involved. However, again, if we go think about that science aspect, it's not necessarily conservation social science, because just sharing information with somebody doesn't necessarily meet to some of those aspects of what methods, what data is being collected. But that said, community engagement can be a way that we can, it could be an approach within social science. It could be a way that we could understand people. And so, a great example is one of our projects that our coastal Carolinas team in North Carolina and South Carolina are working on around marsh restoration. And it's also a community resilience project. And one of the things that they did was held listening sessions. And in these listening sessions, they asked people, what are your greatest concerns? Where are the locations where these concerns are happening? And through community engagement opportunities, they analyzed the data and found out flooding was a huge concern and where some of those flooding hotspots were that then they're going to do for their projects. And similarly, you could also analyze community engagement options and find out how do you best offer those. What are the preferred methods that people want? What's working, what's not? How do you adapt it, right? So doing the engagement alone is not that, but you could also do social science research on community engagement. So I think that that's, to me, it's one of those, it's again, going back to those toolbox of methods to really understand a greater phenomena, to understand trends that are, that can help us then work on our conservation projects or initiatives.
I think that's a really, really great point. And I love that example. I'm calling in from North Carolina, so that coastal project is really interesting. And I think bringing those pieces together is so important. And one thing we like to highlight, I like to highlight, is that the participants on these panels, our speakers today, we are social scientists. We are the ones who can do and implement that social science research when it's needed. However, you don't have to be a social scientist to use social science and have that really inform your work. And I think your engagement integration example is a good part of that. People from all different disciplines can certainly focus and highlight on community engagement, and the plans that are used to do that can be informed by social science. There's so much great social science research that's out there that can be used by all of us. And so we're thinking about
Can I just chime in, Katie?
Yeah, please do.
A follow-up to that is I think like some of the most powerful moments in my work is when social science and biological sciences are integrated. And I think I know we'll get to misconceptions in a sec, but I don't think that we have to be isolated in our work, that actually it's like super fruitful when we can integrate methodologies. And it's also really fun to collaborate, especially for those of us who might be the only social scientist. It feels great to be a part of a team that's addressing questions through a multidisciplinary approach.
Yeah, I agree. As someone who in my work works, as the social scientist with teams of biologists a lot, everyone wants partners, and we want partners from across those disciplines. And I think we all learn so much when we're working on those interdisciplinary teams. And Leah, you mentioned misconceptions, so I'd like to come back to that because I think it's a good balance of defining the field. Within your work and within the bird conservation community, what are some common misconceptions about conservation social science that you run into?
Well, okay, when I was offered this job, I was talking to a good friend of mine who at the time was getting her finishing her PhD in biology. And I gave like this whole spiel about like, this is my job, I'm so excited. And she was like, oh, I get it. You're doing PR for the birds. And I just like come back to that all the time because it's so much more than PR for the birds. But I think that kind of sums up the misconception that this is just about like marketing or a pitch or like getting people to change their behavior to support bird conservation, kind of what Ashley Dare was talking about in her introductory remarks. And so I think a common something that I just want to like throw out there is that I mostly use qualitative methods in my work, and that I think there's a real epistemological difference between quantitative positivist approaches and qualitative approaches. And one is not better than the other. There are times to use one or the other or both together. And so I think that just operating from really what Carrie was talking about, that we have approaches that are systematic, and it might not be what you're used to. And as a team, this is why it's so great to work in teams, is because you can kind of figure out where the gaps or misunderstandings are and really go back to the drawing board and be like, okay, where are our epistemologies like divergent, and how can we like get on the same page? And incorporating that getting on the same page work into the collaboration and teamwork is really important.
those are wonderful ones, and that is a funny comment of the PR for birds. I haven't heard that, but it resonates a lot. Um, Justin, curious about misconceptions for you, particularly also being, newer in your role as a social scientist with a bird conservation organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the bigger ones that I have encountered is that people think social science is cheap, quick, and easy. And it is not. And I think I can really drive this point home with an example of mail surveys. So, for instance, if you want to send out a mail survey to gauge, conservation attitudes or something across a geography for, let's say, producers, um, you really need to invest a lot of resources in that potentially. So some of these online panels can be relatively inexpensive, like Qualtrics, but some stakeholders like producers are actually going to be only accessible really through mail surveys in a lot of cases. And so it can cost anywhere from about 20,000 to 40,000, perhaps even more than that. If you add an incentive for participation, you need to add more money on top of that. Surveys are really expensive, and part of the reason, and this leads to another misconception or misperception, is that you can just send out a survey and pretty much everybody will respond to it. Response rates, especially with producers, in the case of my role, are really low these days, anywhere between 10 to 15% on average without an incentive, maybe a little bit more if you do provide an incentive. So if you want to get, let's say, a sample of 400 producers, you need to really send out 4,000 surveys, give or take. And that's going to cost you, 30,000, 40,000. So it's expensive. And, in the interest of time, I won't talk about the time associated with it, but it also takes a lot of time, IRB approvals, these other factors that have to come into play. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing I'd like to mention is that there's often the misperception that social science can extrapolate to great distances with or great scopes with very small amounts of effort or data. And that's not necessarily the case. And I'll give another example, and this is specifically focused on like a spatial estimate. So let's say that you are working in a county and you want to understand where landowner attitudes are. What is an average value across all landowners for a particular conservation attitude, right? Based on a power analysis, you might need to collect about 90 to 100 responses just to get an estimate for the county. And so if you're going to multiple counties across a wider region, you want to get those spatial estimates. You're already at 400. And if you go back to the mail survey example, you're at about $40,000. So those examples hopefully just drive home the point that it's really important to think critically about how much time, money, and effort is going to be necessary to fully achieve all of your goals related to social science. And I'll probably allude to this later in the panel, but having a social scientist on board, or at least partnering with you at the beginning, is really crucial to make sure that a grant or a project is set up for success.
Thanks. So those are all wonderful, and I think really, really come in across the board. I often use the analogy of the social science button, and that teams often, excited about integrating social science and are looking for that button to press to integrate, and it's really it requires a lot more than the push of a button, but that's why we're all here, and that's what we love to do. And so going back kind of to that point of interdisciplinary teams and partnerships is, I think, where our organizations are going, which is really exciting. We have about 4 minutes left on this panel for this group, and so my closing question for you all is, what mindset do you hope that people that work in the bird conservation community, regardless of what field they're coming from, would really lean into and adopt related to conservation social science? But because we're wrapping up, if you have a different closing point that you want to focus on, feel free to do that. Liat, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the closing, yeah, in closing, just it would be great to have another social scientist, but I really do think that at Point Blue, we just, like, as I was coming on board, our organization went through a strategic planning process and landed on connected conservation as our united theme for this next strategic plan. And I actually wanted to read a quote from our CEO, Melissa Pitkin, about connected conservation, because I think this is the mindset that I'd want to leave everybody with. And that's: conservation is not just about protecting nature. It's about recognizing the interwoven fabric of ecosystems, communities, and scientific knowledge. As climate change and biodiversity loss accelerate, it has become clear that conventional approaches are no longer enough. We must embrace a new paradigm, one that acknowledges the social dimensions of conservation.
That's a great quote. I love it. Justin, closing thoughts from you, and then Carrie, we'll end with you.
Yeah, and I think I'll just reiterate, something I alluded to earlier, which is that I think it's important to think critically about the role of social science in a project very early on, and kind of adding on what Liat said, really integrating it meaningfully. So it's not kind of two separate parts that are kind of shoehorned together. It's really an integrated socio-ecological project, if that is appropriate for your given context. And I think that involves, hopefully if you have a social scientist on board already, obviously you'll bring them into those discussions very early on. But if you don't, there's plenty of willing and able social scientists who would probably be happy to look over your proposal or your pre-proposal or your idea and just give some very quick feedback. And sometimes that can provide a lot of insight into, do we have the current as written? Do we have the resources, time, and effort written into this proposal as needed to fully achieve the scope of what we want for our social science goals within this project? And I think that can be really helpful and really prevent some headaches down the road.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, that comes up a lot, certainly. Carrie, how are you? Closing thoughts?
Yeah, so I think one thing is that, when we approach conservation of habitats, bird conservation, I think we've made it clear it's really holistic. It's not just about the birds, it's not just about the ecosystem, it's also about the people aspect. And I think that, just to give an example of some really quickly of how integrating social science and ecological work can really make a project more complete and address more issues and maybe have a longer lasting approach is some of the work that I've been involved in that has looked at prioritization. So we have a project that's NASA supported. It's Alas Seguros, and it's a decision-making tool to help our end users prioritize areas for different projects. Where do you want to put in a protected area? Where do you want to do regenerative agriculture? And the initial tool had ecological, looking at forest cover, looking at land use. But our new iteration that we're doing is including social dimensions. And that's what part I'm working on. So that when you're putting in a conservation area, is this an area that, what's the land tenure of the area? Is there a high poverty level? Will this provide opportunities? Is there an avatourism potential in this area? And then maybe that's an area where you want to focus on to support local economies, right? And so I think that just shows that your prioritization might change, whereas this might have been the place you worked before, but by including those social dimensions, you now are saying, oh, actually, we might do some of this on the ground conservation work somewhere. And that's where I think it just shows really how to integrate the social and the ecological and climate and all the other types of sciences involved to create more holistic solutions for the problems that birds are facing.
Amazing points, all of you. And I think those closing remarks really transition us well into panel 2, which is going to focus on how we apply all of this. But yeah, I think that idea of prioritization, I use the term social suitability frequently in my work. It's really important because, unless you can do and deliver conservation work, you can't prioritize an area, or at least not if you want to have meaningful outcomes for bird populations and for humans in the area. Thank you all so much. I'll remind the audience that we have the Q&A box. So these 3 incredible social scientists and panelists will be available for questions through that Q&A feature. So please add those there and continue to add your thoughts in our shared Google Drive as well. Thank you all so much. I'm going to transition us to panel 2 without messing with my slides for the sake of keeping us on track with our time. Like I said, panel 2 is going to focus on how we can apply conservation social science to bird conservation, looking at how we address the research to implementation gap that we see that Ashley mentioned in introductory remarks and that we've heard a bit about in panel one as well. So we're going to look at social science methods and theories, but really how we drive those to impact for bird conservation. So we have three incredible panelists for this panel as well that I will introduce now. Dr. Tina Phillips is a social scientist and the assistant director of the Center for Engagement in Science and Nature at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. She's currently spearheading several large-scale human behavior change initiatives that are aimed at decreasing anthropogenic causes of bird mortalities, which we all know is a huge focus in the bird conservation community. Tina's social science research also focuses on understanding and documenting the educational, social, and conservation impacts of citizen science globally and examining the influence of nature engagement on human well-being. Welcome, Tina. Thanks for being here. Our second panelist is V. Ramirez. V is a social communicator and conservation practitioner who has over 15 years of experience working across the Americas. As community engagement specialist for the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network Executive Office at Manamot Conservation Sciences, V supports initiatives that connect people and nature through community-based conservation, through environmental education, and participatory planning. So we're so happy to have you here, V. Thank you for joining us. And our third panelist here is Ashley Gramza. Ashley is a social scientist lead at Playa Lakes Joint Venture. In this role, Ashley guides the integration of social science into conservation work across the Western Great Plains. This includes examining how stakeholder groups think about conservation issues and making sure the human considerations are included in both conservation planning and delivery. Ashley believes the integration of social science into conservation work is key to developing unique and transformative conservation programs and partnerships in the region. Have we lost Ashley? We'll get started, but we'll get started and our team will locate Ashley. But thank you both so much for your participation in this panel. Your expertise is really going to help us dive into this idea of how we actually apply conservation social science and all of this great work that was mentioned in panel one. So let's start allowing you all to introduce yourselves. And maybe you can introduce yourself. Feel free to share how you ended up in bird conservation itself. And maybe you can highlight an example of a project where you have applied social science into bird conservation. So V, I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I just want to share a little bit about me. I'm originally from Cali, Colombia, and my background, as Kathy mentioned, I'm a social communicator. So I jumped into the conservation realm while I was still studying, and I started working with birds in general. And later on, my focus, like the past probably 12 to 15 years, have been focused entirely on shorebirds. And since I'm a social communicator, every time, since I joined, my focus was mainly about telling stories, connecting people with nature. And that's how I came to the social science part and starting to realize the importance of this component and element for our work. And since my native language is Spanish, I will switch to Spanish and I start talking and sharing my experience more naturally for me. Bueno, en nuestro trabajo desde la red hemisférica y
in our work from the Hemisphere Network, my main part is accompanying partners and staff in the implementation of strategies involving communities by using social science elements. Not only, we cannot always do it robustly and in depth, but we try to do this, and our work focuses on this using participatory tools and using social sciences tools. This has been by accompanying partners from the background from the backstage, actually, and guiding conservation plans for them to be more participatory. But again, also governance plans that are more participatory. We have also worked with local producers in Uruguay, Honduras, and many other places in America. So I have a vision of what is happening in other parts of the hemisphere as well. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to share a little bit on how we do this.
Thanks, Fee. We appreciate you being here as well. Tina, why don't you go next? Introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Katie. As Katie mentioned, I am a social scientist at the Lab of Ornithology. I've been here for 26 years, and up until 2 years ago, I was the N of one. I was the only one in an organization of about 300 people. My current research focuses largely on behavior change interventions, as well as links between birding and nature, identity, well-being. And most of my work really centers on individuals and private lands, many of which are involved in participatory sciences. So I tend to work on large dispersed scales and virtual communities, and I use both qualitative and quantitative approaches. And before I give a specific project example, I would like to share our overall strategy for how we do social sciences here, which focuses on first understanding people's motivations, attitudes, intentions, barriers, etc., sort of like the basic foundation for social science. But then also trying to support people with these learnings in overcoming potential barriers for things like bird-friendly, pro-environmental behaviors. So this support can come in various forms, such as very targeted interventions. We also, in a third sort of aspect of the strategy, we want to share people's successes as they're engaging in some of these behavior change campaigns. And we find this really helps to build community engagement, even in just very dispersed communities virtually. So most of these successes happen online. And then finally, we obviously try to measure the impact of the work, adapt it, and then hopefully improve it or improve our next application of social sciences. So the most recent project I'll talk about real briefly, which was just published in Biological Conservation and led by Shelby Carlson, who just joined the lab a couple of years ago, looked at how different messaging frames affects people's intention to make windows safer for birds. And so we did an experimental design within an online survey to randomly assign people to one of 5 different messaging frames around bird glass collisions. So they either were assigned to a frame around social norms, or morality, or efficacy, or emotion, or the factual control-based message. So they were asked about their intentionality to treat windows before receiving the message, then they got the message, and then asked about their intentionality afterward. And we did this with 2 different audiences. We wanted to understand this obviously in a bird enthusiast group, but we also wanted to understand it within the general public. And so that's important because we want to understand how to message to different audiences. And what we learned real briefly is the efficacy message really resonated with the birding group. So they wanted to know how effective would these window treatments be if they put the time and investment into it, while the general public population was really was more influenced by the emotional frame message, which was kind of surprising to us. So we use this information not only to write the paper, but this information was then used to inform a broad communication campaign, which included social media posts and videos that really honed in on that efficacy and that emotion. And then we also did a targeted intervention with a call to action, which was encouraging people to purchase bird-friendly window treatments directly through some industry partners, and then we involved some monetary discounts. So all of that sort of intervention that we had planned was really built on the foundational information that we learned from that first survey on people's attitudes, motivations, and their intentionality. So it had long legs.
Yeah, and I've seen some of that research presented, I believe, in a webinar at some point, maybe. But it's fascinating, and I think really interesting when at least what my instinct would be about what public perception versus people who are more engaged with birds. And a perfect example of why the research and the data really matters, to make sure that our strategies are evidence and research based. So it's really interesting work. Thanks for sharing that example. Ashley, do you want to introduce yourself, your path to your role, and maybe an example of where you're applying social science in your conservation delivery? Okay. Ashley can't unmute. So we'll come back to Ashley soon, hopefully.
I'm good now.
Oh, you're
Sorry.
good.
Um,
Excellent.
my computer decided to restart right before this, so I
Of
became an
course.
unhost.
Yes.
Anyways,
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
yeah, I am the social science lead at the Playa Lakes Migratory Bird Joint Venture, and myself, along with a applied social science researcher, formed the social science team at the Playa Lakes Joint Venture. And so the mission of our organization is to conserve the playas, prairies, and landscapes of the Western Great Plains through partnerships for the benefits of birds, other wildlife, and people. So people play an important role in our mission. And the purpose, I just kind of wanted to talk about the purpose of, how we see social science at our organization. And we really see social science, we try to integrate conservation social science information into our partnership that eventually will benefit bird habitat conservation. So we're kind of specific in that way. And we sort of do that in three main ways at PLJV. I'll just abbreviate our organization. We do that through social science translation and support and guidance to our partnership. We also try to help coordinate social science research across our region and kind of promote collaboration both among social scientists and between social scientists and conservation practitioners and biological researchers. And then we also, through our own researcher, do conduct some very applied research. And so the one project that I wanted to talk about is somewhat similar to Tina's in a way that we're really focused on, behavior that benefits bird habitat or birds. In our case, it's bird habitat, but Tina mentioned just birds in general. So we collected qualitative data through interviews and focus groups of grassland owners and managers to really understand their motivations for and barriers to invasive woody plant management, which is a really big threat to grasslands in our region. And we did this in a portion of our landscape in Kansas and Oklahoma. So we then use this information gathered qualitatively to develop and then test messages aimed at promoting invasive woody plant management behaviors and prevention. And we did this through this iterative process with these landowners. And then we included throughout this whole process conservation delivery practitioners, or you might know them as private lands biologists, who would then be applying these messages to their outreach programs. So we actually included the end users and the practitioners in the social science process so that when we had these messages, they were then using it in their programming. So that's an example that I have.
It's a great example, and I'm glad too, Ashley, that you highlighted your focus on bird habitats, because we lump bird conservation, and all of our organizations have different priorities and different focuses, whether that be targeted species, whether that be landscapes, habitats, a particular protected area, and it does affect the way that we integrate and focus on our conservation delivery, but none of it diminishes the need for social science in integration. And I think that's kind of where this community of social scientists is really powerful in bringing all those perspectives together. So let's think about, as I was saying, social science can inform so much of what we do. It can inform conservation planning, can also inform outreach, can also inform conservation delivery. So in your work, what are the most effective ways that you've seen social science integrated into bird conservation work, whether that be at a species level, at a habitat level, at a protected area level? V, why don't we start with you for this one?
Gracias. Mira, yo creo que una de las formas más efectivas de integrar
Well,
las
I
ciencias
believe one of the
sociales en
most
general
effective
para la
ways of
conservación se hace desde
integrating
el principio,
social
teniendo un enfoque
sciences
sistémico de
in
no solo
general is
estamos
from the very
viendo
beginning,
las
having a
aves, no
systemic
solo estamos
approach of
viendo
we're
los
not only
hábitats, sino
looking at
que
birds
esto
or habitats,
involucra
but
personas. Entonces
this
nos damos a
involves
preguntar
people. So
sobre las
let's ask
personas, sobre lo
ourselves
que valoran,
questions
sobre lo que
about
hacen,
the
cómo
people, what
son.
they value, what they
Un
do, how
ejemplo
this affects us.
concreto que
A
tengo con mis
specific example
pacientes
that
con
I
mi
have,
esposo,
which has
mis
been quite
colegas Abby
successful,
Sterling y
is that
Annie
my
Hauser con
partners,
Georgia
Abby
Pike
Sterling and Annie
han estado
Harrison
implementando
in
ciencias
Georgia
sociales,
by
digamos
have been
que desde
implementing
el
social sciences with an
mercadeo
approach
social,
from
basado en
social
comunidad,
marketing based
donde
on
lograron
the community,
identificar, digamos,
where they
cuáles
were
son las
able to
barreras y las barreras
identify
más
what the values and
importantes para
barriers were the most
reducir
important ones, I mean,
los
to
disturbios o
reduce
preocupaciones para las
the
aves playeras.
disturbances
Y pensé que
for
estaban trabajando en dos
shore birds.
localidades muy
And
cercanas, gracias
they
a
are
lo que
working
les
into
dieron las
close
herramientas
by
de
communities
ese
because they were
framework
given
de las
this
ciencias
friend
sociales.
warrior
Pudieron
tool
identificar
for social
diferentes
science. They were able to
enfoques y prioridades para
identify
estos dos sitios
different
que están
approaches and
relativamente
priorities
cerca.
for
Entonces, en
two
un caso, digamos
relatively
que se
close
enfocaron
places.
en
So in
campañas que
one
promovían
case, they
cambios de
focus on
comportamiento
campaigns promoting
alrededor de
behavioral changes
personas paseando perros con correa
regarding
y
people
trabajaron
having
todos,
their dogs
salían
on a
coleccionando
leash
talleres y
and
ayudando
working
a
on
adaptar
this.
estos
They knew
mensajes
all of the
para este
values
lugar.
and they were able to
Y en
adapt
otro
these
se enfocaron
messages for
más en el
this
tema de,
place.
ok,
And on the
gracias a
other
estos datos nos dimos
area,
cuenta
it
que
was like,
la
thanks to
mejor
this
forma de
data, we
reducir
realized that the
disturbios en
best way
este
of
caso
reducing
específico
disturbances in
era
this
más bien
specific
caminar
case
alrededor de
was
este
actually
sitio importante
walking
para aves y
around this
biodiversidad en general,
important place for birds and
realzar la cultura
biodiversity in
alrededor de este
general
sitio y
and make
divulgar y
people
promover que
proud
se
about
camine
this place,
alrededor
you
del
know, and
lugar de las
promoting
aves.
to go
Y
around the place
gracias
instead of
que
through the
a todo
place.
este enfoque de
And
ciencias
thanks to this
sociales, luego se
whole
logró
social
reducir
sciences
significativamente estas
approach,
preocupaciones. Entonces,
these
este es
disturbances
solo un
were
ejemplo de muchos que
significantly
tenemos que ver,
less after
pero
a while. So
creo que
this
al
is one of the
final
examples that we
el resumen
have,
es
but
como
in the end,
involucrar
the
esto desde el
summary
principio en la
is
planificación para que
getting
nos
social
permita
sciences
priorizar
involved from the
acciones,
planning stage
priorizar
to
mensajes,
prioritize actions,
organizar
to
estas cosas
prioritize
con
message, and
antelación
get all
y
of this
saber que no
stuff
vamos a hacer,
organized
finalmente todo
firsthand.
se va a
We
adaptar
need to know
a un
there is
contexto
no
real, pero si tenemos esa
cooking
visión desde el
recipe. We need to
principio va a ser
adapt
mucho más
this
fácil
from the
hacer
very
esa
beginning,
adaptación.
but it will be easier if we do it from the beginning, you know? Thank you.
Excellent point. And I know I was about to transition to Ashley, and Ashley, I know this is a point that you've made in the past as well about the importance of really implementing those strategies early on. Do you want to share any examples that you have from your work
Well,
along
actually,
the way?
yeah, I was actually going to go for the tail end because
Go
V
for it.
gave such a great example. I've also found that at the end of a project, actually having social scientists be around to help practitioners apply and use social science in their delivery work is really important. So really, there might be examples from the literature, data from the literature that informs their work, but they either don't have access to it or they don't understand it, or even if they have access to it, they don't know how to apply it. So having, folks in applied positions really helping folks on the ground apply that information to their work and having social science insights kind of integrated into training, and onboarding, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I always emphasize, I think I already did it today, how much amazing social science research exists out there. And then providing that support to people in applying it. And also, in the last panel, we talked about misconceptions. I think one place to pause is really considering whether results of a study can be applied to the population that you're working with. And sometimes yes, sometimes with modifications, sometimes just no. And so kind of working on that where you fall in that, I guess, spectrum of application potential is important too, and a role that I think we all play in the projects that we're a part of. And so this is perfect because V mentioned integrating early. We know we want to integrate often. Ashley highlighted integrating at the end and how that can be helpful. Tina, do you have examples from your work of where social science has helped kind of in that middle space to address a key barrier to success, and maybe that be partner conflict, aligning with policies in existence, or generating community engagement, but in that kind of barrier space where people often reach for social scientists to help.
Yeah, I mean, my example is within the context of communities, people in trying to help and support them in creating bird-friendly habitat. So it's a slightly different kind of nuance there, but so we've got a new project that's called Gardening for Birds. The overall goal of this project is to encourage individuals, bird enthusiasts in particular, to create native bird-friendly habitats at their residences. And so in 2023 and 2024, we did a couple of years of pilot testing, focus groups, surveys. This was very much a mixed methods kind of study. We relied on theory of planned behavior, really to understand people's attitudes, their efficacy, social norms around creating bird-friendly habitat. And we learned some really insightful information about the barriers that they face in doing so. And so in 2025, this past year, we just rolled out this campaign where we had about 6,000 community members registered for this. And everything we learned in terms of how we rolled out this campaign came from these early pilot testing and these early focus groups and surveys that we created. And so I'll just give you some examples, if I can, of like some of the learnings and then, how we supported them in this endeavor. So we learned a primary barrier for people that they felt completely overwhelmed by the idea of native gardening, right? And so when we talk about native gardening, people have this vision that they need to transform their entire lawn, right? And even if you're the most avid bird enthusiast, that's a huge undertaking, right? So we wanted to communicate with the people that signed up for this project that you could just start really small, a 2x2 space, a planter pot, a balcony, like we didn't, so there was like this misconception out there that, you had to do this right, you had to have acres and acres of land. And so really overcoming that misconception that people had and letting them know that a tiny single patch of space, one or two plants was all they needed to get started. They wanted to know the right plants for the right habitats in the right regions. And so we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We pointed them to Audubon resources, right? So we relied on a lot of work that already exists. We also learned that deer browsing was a real problem for people. They didn't want to invest the time and money. And so we created some resources for, deer resistant plants that people could have. So a lot of what we did, again, was just based on this initial information that we got. We also encouraged that community engagement by asking people to share photos of their plot before they planted and then after. And we posted all of these things on a website. We also provided people with a yard sign with a QR code so that we could see whether or not social diffusion was happening. People could, link to that QR code and then join the project that way. It was also a way for us to measure. So I think the social science piece of it allowed us to properly support this community engagement that otherwise wouldn't exist and really help people overcome this barrier of thinking that, if they couldn't spend thousands and thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours that they couldn't be someone who could really help bird habitat even in a much smaller space. So yeah, so that's the example that I would use, that the social sciences just helped us so much. And people have told us over and over and over again how helpful that was as part of this sort of ongoing journey where we email them every month and sort of check in with them and give them new tips and new activities to do every month. So they feel like they're part of this community of people working together to improve bird habitat.
That's incredible, and I'm chuckling because I am essentially a case study for your project. We had the local Audubon chapter come out to our yard because we want it to be certified bird friendly. I shouldn't admit to this large of a group of bird conservation professionals, but we're still under construction. but he did. We had all of those problems. The deer ate our brand new native plants we planted. We've had all of the above. So yes, the support is really interesting, and kind of knowing those barriers exist before embarking on the journey, really helpful. And it does make a difference. It also helps to create a community, and as a participant, to feel like you're joining in with others and you're supported. I think all of those things, when informed by good sound social science, are so helpful and powerful. And it's inspired me to continue working on our yard, because we want to upgrade our sign. We're being a poor example to the neighbors. So along those same lines, the focus here is application. How do we apply? So when you think about, there's so many ways to do conservation social science. I know many of us get asked most frequently to do surveys, which are a powerful tool. There are a lot of pros to using surveys, but they're not all we do. So reflecting on our methods a little bit, what methods that you use in your work have been the most useful to you? And can you give a little context as to why you think that might be? And V, why don't I start with you for this one?
Gracias. Digamos que esto
Thank you
me
very
lleva un poco
much.
como a lo que
Okay.
nos
This leads
reflexionaba
me
Justin
to
al final.
reflect about what Justin was reflecting. Social sciences can be a toolbox, to use certain things. And yes, surveys are important. They allow us to learn a lot about values and perceptions of people, but sometimes it is also important to go beyond, meaning one of the examples that come to my mind is what we have been using, and this is stakeholder analysis, social network analysis, and how these connections among people, among participants are generated. And also participatory tools, conceptual models, and mapping workshops as well. An example is like these very specific examples of what we have, of what we're doing right now. We have in Mexico, we know Cristina Loa is working with shrimp producers, and she has included some tools, including surveys and a marketing study of shrimp, to see these insights and how this helps us find green alternatives where we can actually hook the producers in the implementation of shorebird friendly projects. And regarding participatory actions, we have been working at the Guyanas with conservation plans, looking at not only at ecological threats, but the social reasons behind this. So we will not always have time to carry out a full social sciences study, but these tools give us insights, and I talked about my conservation position with technicians as well in Honduras. Many other things are being done by community engagement, and we're trying to get an insight of how to do things, and community engagement can be a tool to collect information, working together with participatory mappings and workshops of producers, seeing how we can protect natural wetlands and prevent their borders from getting broader. And so here, beyond the specific tool, the idea is listening, listening human beings, because they have reasons for making decisions. They have the reasons and purposes, and we need to understand that, because this opens up the doors for more participatory collective construction processes, and social sciences are very important for contributing in this sense. And this has been great support of social sciences to conservation, because they are very useful to create these long-term relations that open up spaces where we can harness what we already have in the communities, in the society. And that way, we can have things that are useful for everyone, including the birds, because sometimes people think that conservation and people do not meet, but that's wrong. Many people value their lands, their territories, and therefore they value what's in there, and birds are included here as well.
Thanks. I love that sentiment to wrap up. We have only a couple minutes left on our panel. So for each of you, as kind of a closing thought, I get asked a lot, and I know you all do as well, but I think it's one of the most common needs from the audience is, when people want to engage and apply social science, what is your kind of one sentence, advice on where to start, either from the perspective of your organization or just from your experience working in the field? Tina, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some good, if you're a non-social scientist and you want to work with a social scientist, I think it's really important for those relationships to have a sort of a mutual understanding of language. I don't know that we've talked that much about that, but I would say a lot of the processes that a social scientist does are very similar to a natural scientist, right? In terms of the way they conduct their science. Methodologies are obviously different, but as someone in the first panel mentioned, it's that idea of evidence base and drawing on the literature. And so just getting an understanding of that piece, that social science is like any other science in terms of its rigor. And I often point people to a paper by Vicky Martin, which was in Bioscience. It's called The Four Common Problems in Environmental Social Research Undertaken by Natural Scientists. Because it does speak to that idea of language, common languages, and interdisciplinary learning. And I'll just say that I work on a project right now with Ashley, Dare, and Kelly that you'll hear from in a bit. It's a complete social ecological integration. And we spend a lot of time in that group listening to the ecologists, and the ecologists spend a lot of time listening to the social scientists. In fact, they often come to our meetings where it's just a social science agenda. And I think that's just really helpful in creating that sort of mutual respect for the different disciplines.
Thank you. I think that's really important. We have to wrap up this conversation so that we can transition to the others. But there are some questions in the Q&A, and these three fantastic panelists will be available to chime in there. I'll also, like I said, be following up on Friday with some resources, and I do have that paper that Tina mentioned in that list. So your questions in the Q&A will also inform, how we put together those follow-up resources for you. So please feel free to add those there. Thank you all so much. We'll transition to our final panel. To moderate this panel, you get a break from listening to me. We'll welcome back Ashley Dare. And I think this is really fitting as panel 3 is focusing on future directions in this field, opportunities and priorities for conservation social science moving forward. So we're welcoming Ashley back to lead us in that forward-looking conversation. And we have 3 panelists to join as well. Dr. Kelly Langs is a postdoctoral researcher and soon-to-be research scientist. Congratulations, Kelly, at Virginia Tech. Kelly is also the assistant director of the Dare Human Dimensions Lab. And there, I know that Kelly is very busy and working on a lot of projects. One of those is focusing on the impacts of bird feeding on humans and birds, wildlife interactions and human well-being, wildlife viewing behaviors, and inclusivity and participatory science programs. So welcome, Kelly. Looking forward to hearing more about all of those. Our second panelist is Maria Inez Salazar. Maria studied political science at the University of Buenos Aires and later completed a specialization in public policy and gender justice. Maria began her professional career working on climate change and gender equality in Ecuador through a joint project between the Ministry of the Environment and UNDP. Maria is currently pursuing a master's degree in education and social sciences and humanities and works as a gender equity and social inclusion officer for BirdLife's Conserva Aves initiative. And our third panelist, who we're looking for, I think, Dr. Jen Lodi Smith is the founder and the director of the Spark Bird Project. Jen's a professor of psychology at Canisius University. She is a personality development psychologist who uses mixed methods research to study identity development over time. Jen's spark birds are her kiddos who helped her notice birds and then fall in love with birding. And her ornithologist colleague, Sarah Morris, opened incredible opportunities to learn about birds. Since then, Jen's had transformative moments with a variety of birds and has really been a wonderful voice to this bird conservation social science community. So welcome to all of you. Looking forward to hearing your inspiration for how we move forward.
Great. Thanks, Katie, so much for kicking us off. I did want to call out to the folks who are in the audience that we have moved questions that were put on the Google Doc into the Q&A module. So if you put a question in the Google Doc or the Google Slides, go over and check out the answers in the question and answer section because the panelists have been answering those for you. And really do encourage folks to take advantage of the Q&A as a great way to hear from folks. We don't necessarily have time to verbalize all of that questions that we're seeing come in, but the panelists who aren't currently speaking are answering the questions as they come in. All right, so with that PSA complete, I wanted to give an opportunity for each of the panelists to tell us a little bit more about themselves. As you all introduce yourselves, as you don't need to tell us that much about where you're currently working because we've already heard that from Katie, but I'd like to hear more about a recent innovation in conservation social science or bird conservation that you're excited about or that you're concerned about. We can start with Kelly.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks for having me here. I'm excited to join. Katie gave a great intro, so I guess I'll just add a little bit more. I was trained as an ecologist and ornithologist and really just started in conservation social science in the last 2 years or so working with Ashley. So it's been an exciting journey for me, and I'm happy to talk more about interdisciplinary perspectives on some of these issues. And my primary work is really on human-wildlife interactions with a focus on bird feeding, working with Ashley and Tina. And I'm really interested in inclusive participatory science and access to nature and well-being. Something that I'm excited about and I guess simultaneously concerned about and would love to talk more about later is the possibility of using AI as a tool to really help conservation social science researchers utilize some of the really rich data sets we collect but don't have the capacity to fully deal with.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly. And thanks for also highlighting that your experience was first as an ecologist and then as a social scientist. And I did want to point that out to folks in our audience that we often see that with folks who work in conservation social science, that they have more of the ecologist or biological background, maybe at the undergraduate level or even at the PhD level, and then they get trained in social sciences. Which can be a great way to have one of those translators sort of across various disciplines is with those folks. So thanks for putting that out, Kelly. And Jen, someone who has been deeply a social scientist from the beginning and now come to bird conservation social science. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts about an innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question and for the opportunity to be on this panel. I think that's really what is exciting and innovating for me at this point in my career is I spent 20 years studying identity development across the lifespan in general experiences of transformative life events across a variety of applied spaces, such as later adulthood and stuff like that. And I found my way to birds in midlife through my children and the openness and the enthusiasm of the existing social scientists working in this space, as well as the birding community in general, as I work to translate that identity development work has been really invigorating. And I think it also is not the concern, but the opportunity of making sure that we are creating obvious ways and inroads for other people who are active social scientists who maybe want to get involved in that work to know how to do that. I had some unique connections that allowed me to be able to do that pretty nimbly that not everybody has. And so I think just making sure that we're making those pathways available and accessible for everybody is one of the really exciting things on our forward.
Yeah, great point, Jen. And hopefully we can loop back around on that I do think Katie made a great point in a previous panel that relates to this, that social scientists don't specify which type of wildlife taxa they are most interested in. I think my lab is one of the few and odd labs in around. I guess also the same with Tina Phillips being at Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Carrie being at a bird organization. But if you talk to academics, it's very rare that you're going to find someone who says, like, I only work on issues related to social science and herps or only related to birds. You can work with social scientists who have really interesting ways of thinking about challenges, and they can bring it to conservation regardless if it's about birds or not. Maria, what about you? What's an interesting innovation that you're excited or concerned about?
Hi, good afternoon with everyone. I'm going to speak in Spanish. De hecho, tengo el placer de estar trabajando en
In
mi
fact, I have
iniciativa
the pleasure
Conservadores
of
por el Camino y
working in the
represento una
Conservadores
innovación
Initiative,
justamente en
which
el
is an
campo de la
innovation for
intersección de las
me
ciencias
in
sociales y
the
la
field of
conservación.
intersecting
Porque
social
parte de una
sciences and
realidad
conservation,
evidente que
because a
muchas
part
veces no
of
se
an
toma
evident
en
reality
cuenta
that
y
many
es que
times is not
en
taking
estos
into account
territorios
is
que
the fact that
buscamos
in these
proteger
territories that we're
habitan
looking
personas
to
que
preserve,
suelen
there
ser
are people,
atravesadas por
people
desigualdades
who
estructurales,
face
económicas,
structural,
educativas, de
economic,
salud, de
educational,
género,
health,
sociales, entre
gender,
otras.
social
Asimismo,
inequalities.
son personas que
Likewise,
tienen
they are
prácticas y que tienen
people who have
conocimientos y saberes
practices
para
and
manejar y
knowledges
gestionar
and wisdom
sosteniblemente estos
to
territorios.
sustainably manage
Conservadores
these
busca
territories.
co-construir
Conservadores
estrategias con
looks
estos
to
aliados
co-build
del
strategies
territorio con
with
un
these
enfoque
in
decolonial.
the
La
field
gestión
allies
tiene, me
with
parece,
a
muy
colonial
innovadora.
approach. This is
En
innovative,
definitiva,
and
la conservación solo será
conservation
sostenible si es
can only
socialmente
be
justa.
sustainable if
Entonces, en
it's
este sentido,
fair from the
transformar
social point
estas
of view.
desigualdades
So,
estructurales y
changing these
reconocer las
structural
necesarios
inequalities and
saberes
acknowledging
locales
and vision,
es la
vision,
estrategia
and
más
seeing
sólida
the
para lograr los
social
objetivos
wisdoms
de
is the
conservación.
strategy that we need to reach conservation objectives.
Thanks so much, Maria. I appreciate you calling out the need to really focus on structural challenges and structural issues as opposed to putting the burden on a marginalized group of people and saying we want them to change. Instead, it's about how do we change our system. And social science can be really helpful for bringing that forward. And I like also your idea about focusing on co-building and co-creation together with various groups. I think that's a great way for us to segue into one of the first things that I wanted to hear from you all about. What are some pressing social, cultural, or policy shifts that social science could help us better understand? And maybe Kelly, I'll move to you because I know you've been working a little bit in this space, and then see if Maria has any more to add.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley, and thanks, Maria. Something that I've been really concerned about is seeing the dwindling funding for equity and justice work in conservation in the United States. And I think a lot of folks are aware, but just in case anybody isn't, there was an executive order earlier this year that blocked federal funding for any projects that included DEIJ or diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And I've seen that, I mean, a lot of our funding is federal or trickles down from federal funding, and a lot of other funders have been hesitant to fill those gaps because of pressure from the US federal administration. And like Maria said, like doing good conservation means including everybody in conservation, especially those who've been marginalized and excluded. And we really need to keep prioritizing this work and finding ways to do it without federal funding and not being afraid because of administrative pressure, both because it's the right thing to do and also because that's what we really need to do to meet our conservation goals. So yeah, I think I would pass it back to Maria, but that's something I'm really worried about and hoping everybody can come together to figure out how we're going to continue.
And Maria, I'm wondering if you want to tell us any more about thoughts that you have from more of a Latin American perspective about pressing social, cultural, or policy shifts that social science could help us better understand and address.
Claro, en la línea de lo que
Of
mencionó
course,
Kelly,
in the
la
line
igualdad de
of what
género y
Kelly
la
says,
inclusión
gender
social
equality and social
son temas que
inclusion
no están
are
separados de
topics
la
that are
conservación.
not
De hecho, son una
apart from
visión
conservation.
indispensable para
Actually,
el
they
éxito en los
are
proyectos de
must
conservación.
be's for
Aquí la
conservation
realidad
projects. They need to be
latinoamericana,
there.
sobre
The
todo,
Latin
es que las
American
comunidades más
reality is that
excluidas,
mainly the
como
most
pueblos
excluded
indígenas y
communities, such as
afrodescendientes, y
indigenous
dentro
or
de estos, las
Afro-descendant peoples, and
mujeres
within these,
suelen ser las
women
más
as
dependientes
such
de los
are the
recursos
ones that
naturales.
depend the
Y también
most on
se ven, por
natural
ende, las más
resources. And
afectadas
then,
cuando hay una
due to this, they
degradación
are
de
the
sus
most
recursos.
affected
Ignorar esta realidad
group when
significa
there is a
ignorar
degradation of these
a quienes
resources.
tienen
Ignoring this
conocimiento en
reality means
territorios, su
ignoring
capacidad de
those who have
gestión y también
knowledge in their
interés para
territory
proteger
and
estos territorios
management capacity,
y
and
por
also the
ende las
interest of
aves.
protecting
Cuando
these
abordamos las
territories, birds
desigualdades,
included.
no
Whenever
solo
we
estamos tratando de
tackle
actuar con justicia, sino
inequalities, we're not
también se
only
busca
trying
fortalecer
to
la
act
gobernanza local,
with justice,
territorial.
but to strengthen
Se busca
local
también distribuir
territorial
los
governance. We
beneficios
are
del proyecto
looking
de
to
conservación de la manera más
work
equitativa o
on the most
igualitaria posible
equal,
entre todos los
effective
aliados
way
comunitarios. Y
with
se busca también
regards to the
construir
resources, and
alianzas
we look
más
to
legítimas
building
y
more
resilientes.
legitimate, resilient
Entonces, en
alliances
resumen,
among
pues pienso que no
everyone.
puede haber una
So, just to
conservación
summarize, I believe
duradera sin una
there
justicia
is a
social que
long-lasting
incorpore
conservation without
estas
social
demandas
justice that
sociales
includes
actuales
these
como
current
la
social
desigualdad de
demands,
género y la
such as
exclusión
gender
social.
inequality and social exclusion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maria. And this relates back to a point that I made in my introductory remarks. I regret to some degree that the way I initially sold social science to the conservation community was in thinking about how can we change people's behavior to get them to do what we want them to do for conservation, rather than thinking about how can we understand better what people want us to be doing in conservation, or understand better about what are the issues happening in the world that are influencing the people who are part of this system where conservation is occurring. And I think this is a really important point as we look toward the future. And I've been really excited to work with Audubon and Manomet on conservation social science needs assessments for their organization, and really prompt their staff to think about other ways that social science can be useful. And I hope that we can do that in other places where we are working together on conservation, so that we're not just doing social science to get what we want as the people who have power in certain places, but instead think about how we can make sure that conservation is for everyone and not hurting people as well. Shifting gears a little bit to talking about approaches in conservation social science. And several of you mentioned this, so would like to hear a little bit more. So Kelly, everybody's talking about AI these days. Which chatbot do we all prefer? And interested in whether you could tell us a little bit more about what does it mean to use AI for social science, and what are the possibilities there?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ashley. Um, I think this is a really interesting topic, and I guess when I brought it up in the intro, I said it's something I'm excited about and also concerned about. So I think I'll talk about the exciting things first and then add a lot of cautions at the end. And I think it's definitely something our field needs to keep discussing and thinking really critically about. Where I see AI as a really promising tool and where I've started playing around with it in my own research and our own work, um, is really for adding capacity as a tool that social scientists use to deal with mostly open-ended survey data. So a lot of times we'll, as social scientists, put out these surveys that we'll get like hundreds or thousands of responses to, and we try to collect qualitative open-ended data there, but sometimes people are writing paragraphs, and when in our lives do we actually have the capacity to really dig into thousands of people's paragraphs of answers? And yet at the same time, we know that this is actually where some of the most valuable responses are coming from. And I think this is a common problem too, outside of just social science research, but also a lot of people do public comment or try to just collect opinions from the public in sort of a less formal research context too. So I think what is really potentially exciting is the ability to use large language models in particular to summarize some of the main themes that are coming up through here. That's where I've seen a lot of successful promise and really good utility. I think something that is still sort of maybe only halfway there is like being able to use large language models to do proper qualitative coding. So really sorting responses into like multiple themes. And I've had success with like really straightforward themes, like positive or negative sentiment, but more complex things I think are still quite difficult because in the end, these are still predictive text models. So there are some things that they will get wrong and not be able to do the same way a human coder would be able to. So I guess those are the things that I think are we can use AI for now and that we may be able to in the future. I think there are a lot of caveats here. If you're doing research, you always need to make sure to be protecting your participant data. So please, I'm just telling you now, do not enter all your survey responses into ChatGPT that is not protecting participant data. So really think carefully about that. Talk with people who work with you on ethics about that and really think about where your data is going. Models are biased. They're particularly biased towards like Western North American and European like paradigms of thought and data. So you really need to be careful about that, especially when you're doing things like qualitative coding and thinking about themes that are arising. So you're, looking through the model at the data with a certain worldview. The models do have an environmental impact. So I think you should be thinking about using them carefully and where you're really getting good utility out of them instead of just throwing things into a model. And then finally, I don't think that models should be replacing a human researcher. Like the questions you're asking should still come from you. The coding frameworks you're thinking about should still come from you and be informed by your questions, your community's questions, the literature, theory. And then you're really just trying to use models as a tool to help you go through all the data, but not to generate like original thought. Yeah. So with that, anyway, I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently.
Thanks, Kelly. Looks like Q&A questions are already coming in on that front and people asking for publications about this topic. So another prompt, right where you've been learning. Jen, you've been doing really interesting work with your Sparkbird project, and I'm interested to hear from your perspective as someone who's a personality development psychologist. What are new methods that we should be thinking about in our field?
Yeah, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk about this, and I could do another hour on it and I won't. But I think from my lens as someone who is really within my first 5 years in this area, but bringing decades of experience in personality developmental science, I think we have opportunities to have collaborative spaces where we're talking about this N of one, right? And so we can create online and build on existing online networks and communities where we can help each other in our data capture and data collection. I think a lot of the work that I have done in my program of research over the years has been based in large, long-term longitudinal data sets that are archival data sets that somebody else started multiple careers ago and have been passed on and have been built from using archival data, using best practices in open science to make sure that we're doing pre-registration of the questions that we want to ask and the questions that we want to answer in those existing data sets. So creating some work to be able to have a long-term, large panel study of birders, people working in bird-related fields, other related constituents, that also would help with some of the costs, right, of buy-in to other panels. That won't solve all of the issues we've been sort of talking around today, but it could certainly help with some of that with efficiency. If there's a small organization that has questions that they want to ask, being able to see what data are already out there to be able to address those questions. It's also going to help with participant burnout. If we're always maybe tapping into those same people over and over, asking some of those same questions, creating some efficiencies in methodology are things that I think we could potentially build from there, as well as those multi-method approaches that so many folks have been talking about today, blending the qualitative and quantitative data.
Jen, really exciting and interesting thing to think about is having that sort of panel of folks that you can keep returning to for years and years and years to come. And that's certainly how so many advancements have happened in the medical field.
Yeah, absolutely. And the longitudinal data analysis part of that, where I always use the analogy of bird banding studies because we volunteer at bird banding stations a lot. And, we always need those old friends coming back and visiting us again and collecting their data over time. And then also the new birds coming in. The same with those panel studies really gives us a lot to be able to at least address some questions in causality where maybe we couldn't do that in an experimental model.
Yeah, so great.
And get hard to reach people as well.
For sure. Well, time is flying here, and I want to move to thinking about opportunities for conservation social science to be influencing the next decade of bird conservation. Maria, I'm interested in your thoughts. Where do you think conservation social science needs to be going in the next decade?
Claro, gracias, Ashley.
Of course. Thank you very much, Ashley. Well, personally, I would like to see in the world of conservation and in the people as such to have a co-leadership approach and an economic approach from the local communities. Stop seeing them as mere beneficiaries from a conservation project to actually seeing them as strategic allies with their own knowledge and wisdom, with their own rights on the territories where we are coming to. I believe this will actually help us to carry out co-diagnosis to understand the needs, development priorities, and local wisdoms there are regarding birds and ecosystems from the community's point of view, and the NGOs or organizations that come in also involve a co-creation and co-design of strategies for conservation, integrating these wisdoms and guaranteeing the protection of the birds' habitats, as well as a equal distribution of benefits and responsibilities of the project. And finally, I believe this will help us strengthen the local governance on one hand by promoting social inclusion and gender equality in the local governance, but preventing there being a dependence of these organizations involved, because conservation needs to be more sustainable, and this will be the way to do so. So social sciences are the sciences that can facilitate this co-creation, co-leadership project in favor of a more sustainable, more inclusive, more equal world.
Thanks so much, Maria. That's a really wonderful vision to be having, and I think that that's critical for us as scientists to be thinking about the next step in co-production. We've talked so much about making sure that the people who are going to use the science are sitting at the table as the science starts. But we also really need to think about the call that you're making of thinking about the local community being part of that co-production too, and making sure that the science that is being conducted is of interest to them and value to them and things that they care about, and valuing their local knowledge, and appreciate your thoughts about that social scientists can really help pioneer that effort. Okay, so we have all these future visions for social science. And we still have our N of 1 issue that many organizations only have one. And then there's the N of 0 issues where many organizations have 0 social scientists engaged in their bird conservation. Interested in what you all think needs to happen. Open to whoever wants to go first. How are we going to get enough social scientists at the table to address all of these challenges and needs? Kelly, do you want to chime in? I know you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can chime in. Yeah, funding is for sure really important. And we're seeing so much interest from lots of organizations, like everybody's mentioned, in social science. But like also everybody's mentioned, it takes real work and real people with real professional experience. And for that, you need funding, ideally to hire people on, but if not, at least to bring people on as consultants for the whole duration of a project. I'm seeing Katie coming on because I know we're almost at time. So the other thing I would say for my own bias is I think interdisciplinary training is really important. Like, I think we should be training our bird conservation scientists and ecologists and biologists in basic social science methods. Like a lot of us have been trained in like basic natural science methods as well. I mean, I actually got to teach in ecology, so not me. But I think there's like so much power in like what that basic literacy gives us in terms of like our ability to collaborate, our ability to know like what kinds of questions are interesting. So those are the two things that I would recommend.
Ditto.
Go, Jen. Just ditto. There we go. All right. Well, Katie, I know we need to wrap up here. I would love to ask my panel just in one word, anything that gives you hope about the future of the field or a brief phrase.
Young voices.
Young voices. Thank you, Jen. Kelly, do you have anything to add about what gives you hope?
All the people who really just really love birds, like in the public as well as like in our group. It's amazing to see.
And then Maria, what about you? What gives you hope?
Espacios como este en el que nos encontramos
Shared
ahora.
spaces as the one that we are in right
Intercambio
now.
conocimientos y buenas prácticas.
Knowledge exchanges and good practices exchanges as well.
Great. Well, I think that's a beautiful wrap up. It has been wonderful to share this panel with you all and also this whole webinar with others. Thank you so much, Katie, for facilitating this.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And I know we're right at time, so I will wrap us quickly. And my closing remarks, which I did have slide 4, but I'm gonna be zen and just close us out. I'm also focused on hope, and I was so inspired coordinating this session, both by the incredible contributors, the panelists you've all heard from, and the organizations that are represented by all of us on the screen here. But also by the registration. We had over 400 people register for this session. And the interest and commitment to this work and to co-production, to inclusion, to community, to collaboration across the bird conservation community is inspiring to me. And I think, we've highlighted that all of us that fall under this conservation social science umbrella have different areas of expertise. We have different passions. We're humans. All of our organizations we work for have different priorities and goals that dictate the work and the projects that we focus on. But I see that as a strength. And I think that moving forward, keeping this group connected, both this conservation social science for bird conservation community, but also all of you who are here who are not conservation social scientists, keeping engaged, keeping lines of communication open, and truly moving forward with the spirit of collaboration. We're facing immense challenges as a conservation community, but that's not new for our field. And I do think that looking forward and focusing on how we can come together and continue our work for both birds and people will keep us united and keep kind of sharing the hope across the community as we navigate really challenging times. So thank you all so much. Panelists, Ashley, thank you all so much for your contributions to today and to our collective work to advance this field and to conserve birds and their habitats and support people who share those spaces. The NABCI Human Dimension Subcommittee and Road to Recovery, who have both co-sponsored this event, have been really engaged in this work and are continuing to come together. The NABCI HD Human Subcommittee is experiencing transition in leadership from myself to the wonderful hands of Kelly and Justin, who you heard from today. So there will be an upcoming strategizing meeting about that. Something weird is happening, but I'm going to just keep wrapping us up. Oh, perfect. We're all together. I'm excited to remain a part of that subcommittee under your leadership, both of you. They will be leading a strategizing visioning session coming up. I'll share details with that in the follow-up email that goes to everybody on Friday, along with our materials. Please join. You do not have to be a conservation social scientist to join us. We refer to those of you who are not as Human Dimensions champions, social science champions, and we need you and we value your input and your engagement in this space so very much. So stay tuned for wrap-up materials from me on Friday. Engage with Road to Recovery, engage with the NABCI, the Human Dimension Subcommittee particularly, but all of the wonderful subcommittees that are doing great work for NABCI. Thank you all so, so much. There will be more. Stay tuned and let's all stay connected in this space. Happy Wednesday.